Makima's a character who has reached so much mainstream appeal that at this point, people who haven't even read Chainsaw Man will preach to you about how badly they want to get put on a chain. And from what I've seen, the majority of community discourse surrounding her isn't actually about how well written she is, but how well developed her assets are, which to me is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, me and the boys got new fab material to do totally family-friendly stuff with, but on the other, the genius behind her character is undermined in favor of horny-ass little kids lactating from the mere thoughts of touching a woman. And it's unfortunate, because I think this horniness to genuinely insightful comments ratio has led Makima to being extremely misunderstood, or at the very least, viewed at through a rather surface-level lens. In fact, out of the Chainsaw Man videos I've seen, I think Schnoz and Sufferance are the only two to have actually presented a deeper take on her. And fun fact, my own video on Makima was actually inspired by Sufferance. It was his take that compelled me to give the topic a go. But while I'm really proud of how it came out, there were errors/points that I failed to accurately convey. YouTube also decided to shove an Excalibur up my ass, so this video will serve as a semi-remake/remastered version of the previous. Basically, I'll be readdressing key points, fixing prior mistakes, and also diving deeper. By the way, don't worry, y'all can watch this as a standalone video, but without further ado, go rub one out, get that post-nut clarity, and let's begin. Throughout the majority of Chainsaw Man, Makima is an enigma. She's a being shrouded in an ever-encompassing darkness, entrapping both us and the characters present in an endless void of doubt, anxiety, fear, and surprisingly, wonder. With every moment she appeared, this suffocating sense of urgency pushed us to uncover the truth, yet no matter how hard we tried, the puzzle remained incomplete. But strangely enough, upon first impression, many were completely oblivious to the terror hidden in plain sight. And it was in that unknowing state when the story presented to us a simple mystery. Who is Makima? What are her intentions? And is she good or evil? Well, at least in the eyes of Denji, Makima is undeniably good. Going from living a life devoid of purpose, Denji's life is given purpose through Makima's lending hand. As he was left with nothing, Makima emerged in front of his weary eyes and hugged him ever so tightly. She was his savior, and Fujimoto actively conveys this by portraying Makima as a beacon of light within Denji's world of darkness, which in reality was the furthest thing from the truth, because the truth was, she wasn't a savior, but a monster. One who had meticulously planned for Denji's downfall from the moment they first met. From showing herself at his lowest to killing Rize moments before their meeting to using Aki and power as sacrificial pawns, Makima acted as a puppeteer as she strung along everyone to her own benefit, eventually orchestrating a tragedy that would bring forth complete and utter destruction. But what makes Makima so interesting isn't necessarily the despicability of her actions, but the progression of getting to that point. It's how the mystery surrounding her is fed into more and more with each concurrent arc, and how in that process, our perception of who she really was became increasingly blurred. At first, we only knew of the ideal Makima had crafted for herself, an ideal that was created for others to latch onto as a means for Makima to continue to fabricate the story of her own greatness. But slowly, cracks started to appear and doubt took hold. Eventually, that doubt stood at the forefront of Chainsaw Man's entire narrative. And when it was at its absolute breaking point, everything culminated into this one scene, creating for the ultimate payoff to a setup that had planted its seeds all the way back in chapter 1. And it's here when everything we had been led to believe shattered right in front of our eyes as we witnessed firsthand a character once defined by her artificial traits shift to one who was truly evil in every facet of the word. That is, until you reach the final chapter. And in just a small exchange of words, this character we had now come to despise suddenly became a whole lot more tragic. Her story was recontextualized, and through it, the sorrowful tale of a girl who was never able to connect was brought to light. And I think it's this conclusion that really solidified Makima as special for me, because as fascinating as the mystery surrounding her was, I've always found the human moments in Chainsaw Man the most memorable. So seeing how this scene, something that's been etched into my mind ever since I first encountered the panel, was given so much weight makes me really appreciative of how masterfully Fujimoto tied the story and its themes all together. Pause. I'm gonna backtrack for a second, but in my original video, I heavily focused on Denji's perspective because throughout a large majority of the story, we view Makima from his perspective. And so this idealized image Makima painted herself as was what we as readers came to know her by, because that's what Denji saw. He saw a pretty girl that, although had heavy weirdo tendencies, still seemed to have a heart. A person he could maybe connect with and show compassion for. But when I was making this point, I also mentioned in early Chainsaw Man, Makima was characterized as good, and so we inadvertently believed that as well, which wasn't exactly accurate. Because whether or not you believed her to be good depended on your individual outlook / interpretation of her character. And I think just the comment section in my original video show that. Take a quick look, and on one end you'll see comments explaining how they were under Makima's control from start to finish, and on the other, you'll see comments explaining how they were doubtful of her upon first sight. And I think the reason for this is because Makima's a character built upon contradictions. There are moments where she's portrayed in a good light, and moments where she's portrayed as something far more sinister. It's a contrast between light and dark, fantasy and reality. For Denji, he perceived Makima as the perfect girl. He saw her as an ideal. And given his perception, it was highly likely for readers to fall under the same trap that he had fallen to, for them to be brainwashed. However, it was also equally as likely for readers to be distrusting of her as well. And I think where you as an individual may have lied was determined by what you focused on and the lens through which you viewed the story. For instance, you may have looked at this scene and thought of Makima as kind because she was giving Denji another chance at life. Or you may have thought of her as manipulative because she appeared at his most vulnerable. Of course, exceptions exist and you might be on a completely different wavelength, but for me, I lean slightly more towards the first scenario I just mentioned, and that's the experience I described in my original video. The only problem was, I presented my experience as the only experience without really taking into account other people's perspectives, so my bad there. But what I really want to highlight is regardless of where you lied, regardless of how much doubt you harbored, whether you immediately thought Makima as evil or not, no one really knew the extent to how evil Makima truly was. Yes, at some point most people knew something was up, but you couldn't definitively pinpoint where her true motives lied. There simply wasn't enough information. Snippets of her real self were hinted at, but the dots never fully connected. It never formed the bigger picture. And it's only in retrospect when all the telltale signs are suddenly on full display. Now, this is something I want to address because I've seen people try to discredit Makima's character by saying her being evil is predictable, which I think not only is a fundamentally flawed argument, but it's also extremely disingenuous to the writing behind her eventual unmasking. Makima's intrigue doesn't come from her being evil. That's not the plot twist that takes place with her exchange with Aki. It comes from Olus being a step away from the truth but never being able to fully grasp it. It comes from being completely blindsided to how vile, corrupt, and twisted her true self was. It comes from expecting her to be fucked up, but not that fucked up. From the very moment the story began, even before that, everything had been under Makima's control. And while readers could sense that that was the case, how far her strings extended and what they would bring about was still up in the air, which is precisely why every time she was on screen, I paid attention. Because just with sheer presence alone, Makima commanded authority. She was a character whose aura in and of itself was incredibly alluring yet terrifying at the same time, and getting to slowly unveil her facade little by little greatly played into my interest. And by the end of it, it was only through opening Pandora's box when all her secrets were finally exposed, but by then, it was already too late. Now, maybe some of you guys are geniuses and actually did predict key story beats before they happened, and if you are, then all the power to you. But I'd say that there are more people who've presented claims surrounding predictability through a retrospective lens than there are those who've done so through that week-to-week experience. That being said, if you found Makima boring or overrated despite what I've presented thus far, that's completely fine. After all, in all aspects of storytelling, people will resonate with things differently. And I admit there are valid criticisms to be made. For example, I would argue that had Makima been more fleshed out, even by just a small collection of chapters, like how Aki's backstory was handled, then she'd be that much greater of an antagonist. And for others, that lack of context/exploration may have been the reason behind their distaste or whelmed feelings surrounding her. But personally speaking, I value what her character does right a lot more than what her character lacks. So far, in trying to convey my thoughts, I've described Makima as evil, which technically is incorrect, but purposefully so. You see, Makima undoubtedly commits the greatest evil thus far in all of Chainsaw Man, but to call her just evil would be somewhat of a disservice to what she really is. How can I say this? Well, because while Makima's actions are evil, her intentions at heart are good. She wants to create a perfect world without war, death, hunger, and the like. And so you could argue that Makima is more so a chaotic good or true neutral type of character than an outright evil person. She's someone who follows the philosophy of the ends justifies the means. For her, so long as it's in purpose of achieving her goals, she's willing to partake in any and all atrocities to reach it. A goal that she believes would presumably be for the greater good. So even if countless die from her actions, if more people are left better off at the end of it, that's a fight worth fighting for. It's definitely a twisted mindset, but it's one worth acknowledging because it goes to show that Makima's core isn't all bad, but rather it's her outlook on life that's extremely misguided. So with that, I bring to you the question, how did she get to this point? Well, the answer lies in two places, Makima's environment and herself. Now, what I'm about to say is all speculative, but nonetheless implied. You see, ironically, for a character who essentially groomed others to do her bidding, it's likely that Makima too was a victim to the same abuse. And the biggest indicator of that is Nayuta. Nayuta is the reincarnation of the Control Devil, but one untainted by power. And through just her existence alone, you can see that the Control Devil was never destined to be inherently evil, but depending on her upbringing, she could be. Which is exactly why Denji took Nayuta under his care, so that she doesn't. But for Makima, she never had that luxury. She wasn't brought up under love, but by a collective who cared very little about Makima the individual and cared more for the Control Devil, a being of authority. It was the government that laid the foundation for her life to be built upon, or at the very least, it was in that kind of climate where Makima grew up in. A climate that advocated for her to grow as strong and as powerful as possible. But in that process, she lost a part of herself, her innocence. Now, of course, there's no real way of saying if anything I've just speculated is correct, but even if we disregard it, there's still one simple factor that we can use to get a glimpse into Makima's reality, and that's her age. Although it's not canonically confirmed what it is, based on her conversation with Kishibe, we can presume that she's lived through historical tragedies like World War II. And in that kind of environment where death and despair ran amok and where power was sought after, it's very easy to imagine how someone could get corrupted. Especially if you believe in the notion that Makima was groomed, because in that case, government influence would have very heavily warped how she viewed the world. The truth of the matter is, Makima didn't start off as evil, but rather a transformation took place, changing her from what she was before to what she is now. In other words, it was the culmination of Makima's lived experiences that twisted a once held naivete to corruption. It was her past, her upbringing, that shaped Makima into the conniving, detached, and heartless person she ended up becoming. Yet, for such a person, what she wanted most wasn't power, but to fill the void residing in her empty heart. She wanted an equal, a friend, a person to call family, a simple, real, genuine connection with someone. But that someone never came. Not because they didn't exist, but because the hole in her heart was far too great to fill. During my read-through of Chainsaw Man, I've always wondered why is it that Makima looks somewhat nostalgic when reminiscing about the group gathering from chapter 20, or why is it that she cries to a seemingly normal interaction. And it was these moments detached from their respective arcs at the time that constantly repeated in my mind. Brief as they were, they left a mark. because for those split seconds, Makima's perfect self was replaced by someone just a little bit more resemblant of human. And honestly, that was comforting because this character who felt so distant instead felt recognizable, grounded, real. But it was only in the context of finishing Chainsaw Man when I properly understood the implications behind these scenes. Those implications being, this was what she yearned for most. But unfortunately, this was unattainable, because her greatest enemy, herself, prevented her from ever attaining it. You see, Makima's abilities entails that she can control those she views lesser than herself, but this power has a tragic undertone to it. Because what it really entails is, in order to grow stronger, she has to naturally view herself as superior. She has to put herself on a higher plane of existence than all those who surround her, which in turn would cause her to lose sight of her one innermost desire. And that's exactly what happened. She lost the ability to find an equal because in the pursuit of power, she could no longer view others as equals. In other words, the more power she amassed, the further she distanced herself from ever finding a friend. After all, how could she, when she couldn't even see people as people but as pets identified by their scents? Sure, she may have achieved class, status, prestige, respect, and much, much more, but to her, none of that mattered. They didn't bring any value. Because at the end of the day, no matter how strong she became, her place in the world remained the same. She was left at the top with no one to relate to, completely and utterly alone, desperate to connect yet unable to do so. But what I think makes her story even more so tragic is it was her own unwillingness to open up that entrapped her in her contradictory existence. You see, from the very moment she and Denji first met, she never once viewed Denji as Denji but as a mere tool to employ. And that's where her biggest character flaws lie. Her inability to look past her own preconceived notions and her continual perception of everyone else being inferior. Because had it not been for these flaws, Makima's artificial bonds with Denji and Aki could have instead been the genuine article. It could have been a mutual friendship between individuals who all at their cores just wanted to find love. Not just in the romantic sense, but also the love between family, or the love between lifelong partners, or the love between people with common ground. It really was that simple. It just took that one step to accept people for who they were, for themselves. But Makima never did, because she was too tunnel-visioned in her own ideals. And therein lies the problem. Makima had already created a mold others had to perfectly fit in order for her to view them as equals, but because no one did, she instead viewed them as unworthy. Yet what she failed to understand was that's not how relationships work. You don't just find someone to perfectly fit what you desire. For a relationship to function, sometimes there has to be compromise, but it's through understanding that and approaching each person with an open mind where real relationships blossom. In the final fight between Makima and Denji, the two have a brief but still insightful exchange I really want to highlight. Denji asks Makima, in this ultra awesome perfect world you're gonna make, will there still be crappy movies? And Makima responds, I believe the world would be better if bad movies ceased to exist. And it's here where the duality / contrast between Makima and Denji is directly laid out in front of us. While Denji is willing to be experimental and values the highs just as much as the lows, Makima desires perfection in the literal sense. She has a certain ideal she wants to uphold, and since Denji's perspective doesn't align with that ideal, she finds him disagreeable. But when it comes to Chainsaw Man, well, he's the only creature in existence she's ever placed above herself. Chainsaw Man doesn't spit, he doesn't wear clothing, he doesn't talk, he is the very embodiment of chaos. And yet, despite not getting him at all, Denji was the one chosen by Chainsaw Man. And that fact is something Makima literally cannot fathom. But the reason as to why she can't is once again due to her own delusions. The truth is, Makima herself doesn't understand Chainsaw Man. Instead, she has her own headcanon of what she thinks Chainsaw Man is, and so she idolizes him to fit that perfect mold. But beyond that idolization, she only knows about Chainsaw Man the entity and not Chainsaw Man the individual. Yes, Chainsaw Man is an incarnation of chaos, and maybe once before that's all he was, but now he's Pochita, someone who values these tender, intimate moments more than anything else. He's not the ideal Makima wanted him to be. He's flawed. But despite being flawed, he's still able to find a friend because his flaws don't fucking matter. What matters is actually making the attempt to build, to grow, to connect, a willingness to accept the bad with the good, sticking by someone's lowest and genuinely being happy for them when they're at their highest. And so when it's revealed that the person Makima had been fighting this entire time was in fact Pochita, the very thing she's always idolized, the very thing she's been berating throughout the entirety of this final clash, Makima's entire world is shattered. And in that moment, I realized her ideals, her image of perfection was something she internalized, but not something that was tangible or realistic. She thought Pochita as an ideal, but he wasn't. She thought Denji as disagreeable, but that was only because she already held contempt due to him being different from what she desired. And it's here where I think the contradiction and tragedy of Makima's character truly shows its wings. Because we're shown a character once portrayed as an ideal being unable to let go of her own ideals. In the first place, Makima's entire approach to forming relationships was misguided. Because instead of looking at people for who they were, she placed them in a box. She made her own preconceived judgments and defined them by their superficial qualities. And through these actions, Makima inadvertently isolated herself in her world of fantasy. In other words, she was the biggest contributor to preventing her own dreams from ever being brought to life. She sought out after perfection, but couldn't realize that even in imperfection, there's still value to be found. In fact, these people she viewed as inferior, as unrefined as they were still people who she had the chance to grow something with. But Makima wasn't ever willing to accept their imperfections, whereas they were. And that difference in mindset is precisely why even the most clashing of personalities was able to create the deepest of bonds, which goes to show this entire time Makima could have had what she'd always wanted, and all it took was for her to reach out, for her to be genuine. But unfortunately, without ever even coming to terms with her own flaws or even getting closure, she falls to the hands of the one person she could have been closest to. After all, despite being so drastically different, both of them yearned for the same things, someone to love and feel compassion for. Now, obviously no degree of sympathy or understanding will ever discount the atrocities Makima has committed and lives she's ruined. No matter how many justifications there are, what she did was undeniably wrong. It was despicable. But despite that, is she redeemable? Would you be able to forgive her given the context to her actions? Well, for me, it's complicated. Because truthfully, while I can't bring myself to forgive her, I can't bring myself to fully hate her either. I do think that if she was still alive, there may have been a world where she could have become a good person. But the possibility of her being too far gone and bringing about even more carnage is equally, if not more likely than the previous possibility. And where you personally stand on this issue is a stance I leave entirely to your own judgment. But thankfully, neither Chainsaw Man's finale nor Makima's death mark a tragedy, but rather new beginnings. You see, through Nayuta, a person who still had a lifetime's worth of pages to fill, the chance to attain what Makima never could was still possible. It was still possible for this girl who had every right to be happy, to be given love. How? Well, just as I've said in the past, the answer was there right in front of our eyes. An answer founded in the simplest of gestures, from a place emanating with warmth. Call back to Makima and Denji's date. In it, they saw one particular scene from one particular movie, and it made them both cry. It wasn't anything special or outstanding, but nonetheless, it showed two people embracing one another. And this embrace was what Makima wanted so dearly, an embrace filled with compassion. So, to answer the question of how, It's actually really, really simple through lots and lots of hugs.